Multiple people are dead after several shootings at massage parlors in Georgia Tuesday. Atlanta police say 4 women, all believed to be of Asian descent, were shot and killed at 2 spas in the city.
At the beginning of this year, so in January, I started hearing about more violent attacks. So this is like even beyond yelling slurs at Asians or like vandalizing buildings, but actually attacks of senior citizens. And then I started hearing about the kind of attacks that were happening in New York City. So I would say the last few months, it's been much more in front of my mind.
The data and both the incidences of violence and the data around it, I've definitely become, I think, much more aware of in the last 3-4 months, perhaps.
I actually heard about it from Paige Hagee, had an article in our State Tribune highlighted this. So I read it there and I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that being a problem here.
I remember I was pitching a story in my intro to journalism class, and it was about the xenophobia that I had read about on the New York Times. Yeah, so it was last year.
It's always been an issue, but something that resurfaced and I was reminded of again in early March with the shooting in Georgia. I was scrolling on my phone through like my news app and I started seeing the news articles roll in, and it just was a moment where you're like, it happened again.
The second I heard that there were hate crimes happening in the city, I knew what was being said. Someone was probably yelling, "You don't belong here." Somebody was probably calling them COVID-19 or accusing them of being the pandemic. And I was fearful for a lot of my friends that are Asian American, and I texted a couple of them and was like, hey, if you're out late and you don't want to walk home alone, I don't know what good 2 minorities are going to do walking together, but I'm willing to walk with you.
I was horrified and I was angry. I wasn't fearful for myself, but I definitely was fearful for my Asian family and Asian friends.
I was more worried for like the elders who could easily be targeted. More recently, I have become much more worrisome for my safety though.
I started Ubering to some places rather than walking if I was alone at night, and those are things I wouldn't normally feel like I had to do.
Even regardless of like whether this was like sexually motivated or racially motivated, I think really from that day on, I started feeling a little bit more on edge. I started thinking about my family. Right now, my dad, who's Chinese, he's living in Singapore. This is a kind of not great feeling, but I felt a little relieved that they weren't in the United States. I know my dad has been a target of like slurs and been misunderstood because of his race, so it made me feel very sad.
I suppose right after the Atlanta shooting, when I noticed that my friends' schools were issuing statements, I think that's when I realized, oh, King's has not done anything. They did that for Black Lives Matter, and I looked on their Instagram page, they did. Tim Gibson actually wrote a statement about it, and I immediately emailed Tim Gibson himself, and I asked him to do the same. I was imploring him to release a statement on behalf of the AAPI students, and I never got a response, so yeah.
My job and a couple of my other friends' schools, they all spoke out and were basically just saying, we denounce this. So King's silence was definitely deafening in that moment, but it wasn't something new.
I think there's a valid place for both, for taking a period to ourselves and to think about the issue, and then there is a time to speak out and as Christians just proclaim what we know is true.
When they didn't immediately say something, I didn't think too much of it, but time passed and I was like, I'm Asian American, one of the few in your school. The fact you haven't said anything has me more concerned for my safety and how I might be treated if the hate somehow spreads in our own school.
When it comes to the school, I think we also need to look at the data here. And what the data is showing me that we've had more incidences in New York and in other cities of either abusive speech or violent actions toward Asian people, and that's one of the reasons we need to be more concerned.
We do have Asians in our community, and there are a lot of Asians in New York City. Chinatown is a 10-minute subway ride from the school, and so I thought it would be really important for the school to address the violence that's occurring and to condemn the racism so that students are aware of what's going on and they can be more intentional about condemning racism when they see it.
I tend to not find the statements that meaningful. so I wasn't really looking to King's to provide a statement. It was more important to me that we were having conversations on an individual level or in other kind of settings.
So I would expect if King's had said anything that they would gather all the staff and faculty together and had some kind of meeting where we come to some consensus. In my experience with the chaired the University Diversity Committee, we created the University and Diversity document, the Biblical Theology of Diversity for King's. It was a multi-year project that involved students and staff and faculty. It involved waves of going back to faculty and staff and saying, here's the statement, and tweaking it and getting it cleaner and tighter to say what we meant without unduly saying the things that we didn't want to say, which that was a 6-month process in and of itself. And so I, having gone through that entire process, to say something that I thought was pretty biblically obvious and say it clearly in a way that all my colleagues could sign on to it, which they did, I realized that kind of making a hot take, hey, we stand against this, or that seems more difficult to me, I guess, after having gone through that process. But even saying all of that about the process to say something meaningful, there is a sense in which I did expect the people of King's, if I can use the term, to say things meaningful, to say things that were maybe even more from an emotional space of concern or anger or complexity. So yeah, I expected people, my colleagues, students, and friends to actually go out and say things and react to it publicly, like they react to all kinds of things.
The student body has definitely spoken out about this issue, and I personally was involved in a lot of conversations with other students about how we were all feeling and how we were all seeing and assessing the situation. I think about the statement that the cabinet released and the time of prayer that was set aside, the prayer of lament that was read at PRS.
I think a community update 2 weeks after the fact seems very reactionary. It seems like you felt the pressure, you felt the heat building, and you were like, better late than never. And in a way, true, better late than never. But I don't know. Everything that was done other than the community update has been student-led. Nothing else has come from the actual top of it.
I mean, there was basically no communication about it, like even 2 weeks after the shootings happened. And I had to really push the school to start having discussions about it and to even host a prayer meeting for it. I don't see any negatives to speaking out about this. I don't see how it could hurt the school in any way to condemn racism as a sin.
I haven't seen enough cry out, and I haven't seen enough lamenting from the school. I think there were a few prayers that happened, but no, I don't think the school has done enough.
And I think we should do more. Let's look at the data. Let's listen to students. We need ideas from students, from faculty, to think about what we should do that's important.
I actually have suggested that we think about doing bystander intervention training, right? So rather than just saying that we don't believe this, one of the things I can do is if I see something like that, I mean, Christ put his body on the line for the rest of us, and I actually think he calls us to do that as well. I think it would be wise for us to have measured, real, tangible ways. I mean, you can get training where they teach you. You can divert people's attention. You can do all kinds of things to get them to stop doing what they're doing, right? You can throw things at them. You can stand in between the person. Like, I would just have loved it to have seen every single one of these instances, even if they're going to happen, that a Christian physically stood in between the victim and the attacker and took the blows on behalf of the person. I would like to see students who want to do that, and faculty and staff who want to get that training and like commit to intervening when they see things like this against any person.
And I think the individual conversations is just one place where we can really push these conversations forward, and just listening to individuals' experience and in a lot of ways understanding their emotions, empathizing with them.
I'd say less hesitancy, less worrying about whether this is a performative act or not. I don't think it is. I think it's doing the bare minimum, to be honest.
It would concern me if King's was the sort of place where the marketing team, who I'm part of that team, were basically acting as mouthpieces for every social issue. because I think the kind of urgency that goes along with that way of engaging the world can actually make it harder to have good faith conversation with others. Now with the the hate crimes directed against Asians, it's hard for me to see how that would have been an issue. It just is kind of like a very obvious statement to say. So I don't really see an immediate downside to that. I do see a downside in becoming a kind of like a culture where we feel like we need to weigh in on everything.
I think there's an opportunity for Kings when we do speak out about injustice, and I actually think Christians and Christian institutions can offer hope, but actually a redemptive hope. I think that says Genesis 1:27, we're told that we're made in the image of God, and that's why people are created equal. And so the idea of human worth and personhood and dignity comes from faith. From our faith, it can also probably come, I think, comes from other faiths. But I think that's one thing that religion does offer hope for, is getting beyond tribalism. Jesus talked about that kind of thing. And the idea of humans all being, having dignity and worth, that's something that we should care about.
Right now, in this day and age where social media and actual action is everything and not just simply saying thoughts and prayers, the consequence for not speaking out is alienating your students. It is making, especially your Asian American and Pacific Islander students, feel like they don't belong in a community where they are wanted and loved. I understand we go to conservative college and it's seen as just like call out culture, but the fact of the matter is a school is for its students, and your students are hurting. Speak out.
If you are a white person who has been silent so far, a good way to break your silence now would be to reach out to your Asian friends. Even if they don't want to talk, and you shouldn't force them, you can at least let them know you see what is happening in our city, that they are not invisible or alone. When our neighbors face injustice, the least we can do is say that we see it, we lament it, and we are on their side.